Okay, let's try and unpack this quote. Metaphors bite and dissonance. Well, dissonance apparently ignites the flames of musical passion. That's quite a statement, isn't it?
It really is. Powerful imagery.
Yeah, and it almost makes you think about, when you're wrestling with a new complex idea and it feels a bit, I don't know, clunky, like piece is not quite fitting.
And that tension.
Exactly, that feeling of tension as you try to figure it out. Well, that's sort of what we're diving into today, but specifically through the lens of music.
Precisely. We're looking at Chapter 7, The Nature of Discord, Tension, and Release. And our goal here, really, is to get a solid grasp on this whole idea of dissonance in music.
Right.
What it actually is, why it's so important, and crucially, how it creates that tension and then, the release that follows.
And we're looking at it from different angles.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
We'll touch on the acoustics, the physics of the sound itself, but also how we perceive it psychologically, and even how its use has changed dramatically over history.
Right. So let's start basic. What is dissonance, fundamentally? We kind of know it when we hear it, that slightly off sound, but what's going on?
Well, think of dissonance as a quality in music. Could be a chord, could be just two notes that sounds unstable or tense, maybe even a little harsh or unpleasant to our ears initially.
Okay, unstable.
It's the opposite of consonance, which feels stable, pleasing, sort of at rest.
Right.
But, and this is really important, dissonance isn't inherently negative, not at all. It's actually a vital force in music. It's the engine for energy, for expression. It's absolutely central to how Western music especially developed.
So it's not just composers hitting wrong notes by accident.
Definitely not. It's very intentional. But what's happening acoustically in the sound waves themselves?
Yeah, what's the physics behind it?
It comes down to how the sound waves interact. When you play two or more notes together, their frequencies, the sort of speed of their vibrations, create relationships. If those frequency relationships are complex mathematically speaking, they form ratios that aren't simple whole numbers. They interfere with each other in a more complicated way.
Interference patterns.
Exactly. Imagine waves bumping into each other instead of smoothly combining. This creates acoustic roughness or beating. That's the physical basis of what we perceive as dissonance.
Ah, like when two instruments are almost in tune, but not quite, and you get that wavering sound.
That's a perfect example of acoustic beating, yes. And generally, notes that are closer together in pitch tend to have more complex frequency ratios, leading to more noticeable dissonance. It's that slight clash creating the instability.
Okay, so it's rooted in physics.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned perception, how we hear it. That's not just physics, right?
Not at all. While acoustics gives us the raw material, how we interpret that sound as dissonant or consonant is subjective. It's learned and heavily influenced by our culture and our listening experiences over time.
So something that sounded jarring centuries ago might sound perfectly normal now.
Absolutely. Take certain intervals common in jazz or even some pop music today. In medieval Europe, they would have been considered extremely dissonant, maybe even unusable. Our ears collectively have adapted.
So our perception evolves. Is there any underlying reason why we tend to prefer simpler sounds, though?
Well, there seems to be a general principle that simpler frequency ratios, like an octave 2.1 or a perfect fifth 3.2, are processed more easily by our auditory system.
Easier on the brain.
Kind of, yes. It likely goes back to how our hearing evolved. Clear, simple relationships are just less work to make sense of. And that instability from the complex ratios, the dissonance, that creates a psychological need for change.
Ah.
The music feels like it needs to go somewhere to resolve to a more stable, consonant sound. It's like tension in a story, building suspense.
Dissonance is the cliffhanger. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, source material mentions specific types of dissonant intervals. Can we talk about some of those?
Sure. They each have their own characteristic flavor of tension. Let's start with the minor second. That's the smallest possible interval, like C to C sharp.
Right next to each other on the piano.
Exactly. And it's highly dissonant. Creates a real sense of friction, maybe unease. Composers often use it to suggest pain, conflict, that kind of intense feeling.
Yeah, you can almost feel them rubbing against each other.
Yeah.
What about the major second, like C to D?
A bit wider and slightly less dissonant than the minor second, but still definitely tense. It can sound kind of grating or maybe urgent, depending on the context, like something needs to happen quickly.
Urgent. Okay. And then there's the tritone. That one sounds dramatic.
It is. The tritone is fascinating. It's the interval right in the middle of the octave, like C to F sharp. 6 half steps.
Perfectly symmetrical.
Exactly. And it sounds very ambiguous, very unsettling. Historically, it got nicknamed the Diabolus in Musica.
The devil in music.
Yep. Because it lacked a clear sense of resolution in early music, it felt disruptive, even dangerous. It has this unique instability.
Wow. Okay, what else? The sevenths, minor and major.
Right. The minor seventh, like C up to B flat, creates quite a strong tension, but maybe more of a longing or an unresolved feeling. It often functions as part of a dominant chord.
Dominant, meaning it really wants to resolve back to the home chord.
Precisely. It has a strong gravitational pull towards the tonic, the home bass. It asks a question that needs an answer.
And the major seventh, C to B natural.
Even more tense, that one's probably the most dissonant of the common sevenths. It has a very strong pull downwards or upwards to resolve, often sounds quite jarring, or maybe intensely yearning.
Jarring or yearning. Interesting distinction.
And again, how dissonant we perceive any of these isn't fixed. It depends on the harmonic context, what other notes are sounding, and like we said, the historical period and style.
So a major seventh could sound stable in some modern music?
Absolutely. In some 20th century styles or certain jazz harmonies, it functions almost like a consonance. But in Bach's time, strictly dissonant, demanding immediate resolution.
So these aren't just random bad sounds. They're tools, each with its own character.
Exactly. They're sonic flavors, expressive potentials that composers use very deliberately to shape the emotional contour of the music.
Okay, so this brings us squarely to musical tension. Dissonance is the main ingredient for creating that feeling of anticipation, right? How do composers actually use it to build that tension?
Well, there are several key ways. One very common technique is simply delaying the resolution.
Just holding on to that dissonant sound longer.
Exactly. You create a dissonant chord or interval, and instead of resolving it right away, you extend it, maybe move to another dissonance. This stretches out the feeling of unease, builds anticipation. It makes the eventual arrival at consonance feel much more significant.
Like drawing out the suspense in a film scene.
Perfect analogy. Another way is to build intensity by moving through a series of chords that become progressively more dissonant.
So it ramps up.
Yes, creating a
Emotional
sense of rising
contour of the-
tension, often leading to a musical climax. Or conversely, you can use a sudden, unexpected dissonance for shock value.
Like a jump scare, musically speaking.
Sort of. It can grab your attention, create disorientation, or signal a dramatic turn.
Makes sense. What about chromaticism? That was mentioned too.
Right. Chromaticism means using notes that are outside the main key or scale of a piece. These chromatic notes often create more complex, nuanced dissonances against the prevailing harmony.
So it adds color, but also more tension.
Yes, it adds color, ambiguity, and definitely increases the harmonic tension and complexity. It's like adding subtle, unexpected spices to a dish.
So really, the whole journey of a piece of music is shaped by this ebb and flow, this building of tension with dissonance and then the release.
Absolutely. You can think of musical form as a journey through different states of tension and release. Dissonance provides the hills and valleys, the challenges that make the arrival points, the resolutions, feel earned and meaningful. Without that contrast, music would feel static, wouldn't it?
It really would. Okay, so let's talk about that arrival point, resolution, the return to consonance. You mentioned it's not just musical, but physiological.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Resolution is that movement from dissonance back to consonance. It provides the feeling of release, stability, closure. And there seems to be a basis for this in how our brains process sound.
How so?
Our brains naturally seek patterns, stability. When we hear unstable, complex sound patterns, dissonance, there's a kind of cognitive tension. Moving to a simpler, more stable pattern, consonance, releases that tension. It feels like auditory sense-making.
So a good resolution feels satisfying on a pretty deep level.
It really can, yes. But how effective or satisfying that resolution feels also depends on listener expectations.
So what we're used to hearing.
Exactly. Expectations shaped by the musical style, the culture, and how the composer has set things up within that specific piece. A resolution needs to feel prepared, logical within its context.
And are there typical ways composers make that move from dissonance to consonance feel smooth?
One very common way, particularly in tonal music, is through stepwise motion.
Meaning the dissonant notes move by the smallest possible interval.
Precisely. Usually a half step or a whole step to the nearest available consonant note. It's like guiding the sound gently back into place rather than making a big leap. It feels more natural, more connected.
Can you give an example?
The classic one is the resolution of a dominant seventh chord. Let's say in the key of C major, you have a G7 chord, G, B, D, F. The F, the dissonant seventh, typically wants to move down by a half step to E. And the B, the leading tone, wants to move up by a half step to the tonic, C.
That pull you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Those small, purposeful steps create a very strong, clear sense of arrival back home to the C major chord. And the more tension you built up with the dissonance,
The bigger the sense of relief when it resolves.
absolutely. It's musical drama 101. Conflict and resolution played out in sound waves. It's a pattern we find echoes of across cultures and history.
Which is a great segue into the historical perspective. The source mentions our relationship with dissonance has really changed over time.
Oh, dramatically. It's a fascinating evolution in Western music, if you go way back to the medieval period or the early Renaissance.
Dissonance was handled very carefully.
Extremely carefully. It was used, but very sparingly, and under strict rules. You couldn't just throw in a dissonant interval anywhere. How you approached it, and especially how you resolved it, was tightly controlled. The ideal sound was predominantly consonant pure.
Like a carefully measured spice, as you said.
Exactly. Then, moving into the Baroque era, think Bach, Handel composers started using dissonance more freely, more expressively, to depict emotions. Things like opera really pushed this forward.
More drama needed more tension.
Right. Though still generally within a framework of clear resolution. Then came the classical period, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. Dissonance became truly integral to the harmonic language itself.
It wasn't just for special effect anymore.
No, it was part of the engine driving the music forward, creating expectation and forward momentum. The interplay between dissonance and consonance became much more sophisticated.
You can really hear that tension and release in Beethoven, for sure.
Definitely. And then the Romantic era, Chopin, Wagner, Tchaikovsky, they pushed the boundaries even further.
More emotion, more dissonance.
You got it. They used more complex chords, prolonged dissonances, lots more chromaticism, all to express a wider and more intense range of feelings. Deep longing, anguish, ecstasy. Tonality started to stretch.
And then the 20th century arrived.
That things really exploded. Many composers started to fundamentally question and even abandon the traditional system of tonality altogether.
So the old rules about resolving dissonance didn't necessarily apply.
For many, no. Dissonance became accepted, even celebrated, as a valid sound in its own right, not just something needing resolution. Think of composers like Schoenberg developing atonality, or Stravinsky's sometimes jarring rhythms and harmonies. The whole landscape of acceptable sound expanded enormously.
So it's been a journey from, like, strict avoidance to careful use to sophisticated interplay to outright embrace.
That's a great summary. Our collective ears have learned to appreciate a much wider palette of sounds. It's an ongoing evolution, really.
It really is fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. We've seen dissonance isn't just noise, it's this crucial element, creating instability and tension.
Right, based on those complex acoustic relationships and how we perceive them.
And there are different flavors of dissonance, specific intervals composers use strategically,
Minor seconds, tritones, sevenths, each with its own character.
all used to build musical tension, which then finds release in resolution that move back to stability, back to consonance.
And that whole process, that relationship with dissonance, has evolved hugely throughout music history.
Understanding this really does give you a different way to listen, doesn't it? You start hearing that push and pull, how composers are manipulating tension to affect you emotionally.
Absolutely. It deepens your appreciation for the craft, for how music actually works on us. It's the engine driving the story.
Which kind of leads to a final thought, maybe a bit philosophical. If dissonance is so essential for musical evolution, for creating depth and satisfaction through tension and release, could the dissonances in our own lives, the challenges, the conflicts, be similarly necessary?
That's an interesting parallel, that perhaps those moments of difficulty or instability are actually what push us towards growth, towards change.
Yeah. What kinds of resolutions are we aiming for, maybe subconsciously, in the middle of our own messy, sometimes dissonant experiences? Something to think about, maybe.
Definitely food for thought. Considering the music of our own lives through that lens.